What's going to happen?
So you might be thinking about what's going to happen next. I think if I'm reading a story, I'm sort of always thinking about what's going to happen next. When I'm reading a nonfiction text, I tend to be thinking more about what I think I'm going to be learning. Does that make sense? Do you predict just at the beginning of something that you're reading, or do you sort of predict all the way through? Yeah. Is it okay when you're reading, if you kind of read along and you notice that some of the predictions that you made didn't work out the way that you thought? Is that okay? Does that mean you're allowed to read it? No. It actually means that you're a thoughtful reader. When you take the time to stop and think about your predictions, to kind of revisit them and say, ooh, is this the way that I thought it was going to turn out, or not so much? How has my thinking changed? That's what great readers do. Question. We know that as we're reading, we're constantly asking questions. We're constantly thinking about what are we wondering, what are we confused about in our reading. Again, this is something that we do all the way throughout our reading. Clarify. What are we doing when we're clarifying, Patty? Noticing words like the. Well, let's see what the chart says. It says clarify. Notice words or ideas that confuse you. What can you do to clear it up? Yeah, you could. So one thing I'm thinking is that when I'm clarifying, I'm just paying attention to what's confusing to me. When you get confused, it could be because there's a word that's really hard to read, like you were saying, I think. Or it could be, you know the word, you can totally read it. But it's just that the ideas and the concepts are really tricky or really confusing. I gave some of you an example yesterday about how my husband is an accountant. And I told you that his job is that he works with numbers. He goes around to all the departments in the state of Illinois, the Department of Health, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Education, and he looks at the way that they're spending their money. And he says to them, hey, you're spending your money really well, or you're spending too much on this, or not enough on that. So that's what he does. Sound exciting, boring? What do you think?
I'm excited to go to the different places.
Yeah?
Yeah, but
To me, looking at numbers all day is pretty boring. To me. So when I go home and look at his accounting magazines, his magazines that tell me all about numbers and spending money and stuff like that, is that going to be terribly interesting for me? Not really. Is it going to be something that I have a lot of background knowledge on? That I know a lot about? Really not, because I'm a reading teacher. So I know that when I go home and I read his accounting magazines, there's a lot of ideas that confuse me. If I'm reading a book about teaching reading to 4th graders, is there going to be a lot in that book that's confusing to me? Not as much. So when you're reading, especially if you're reading nonfiction, pay attention to what's confusing to you. Sometimes it's the words, sometimes it's the ideas or the concepts, sometimes it's the vocabulary. You're reading vocabulary words that you feel like, ooh, I think I know this word, but I'm just not sure what it means. Pay attention. Notice that. What can you do when you're confused? Can you just say, oh, well, I'm done. I should just go home? No. What can you do? What can you do about it, Xander?
ask someone who might know.
You could ask somebody who might know. What if you're reading on your own? And there's no one really around to help you? What could you do? Sometimes there are tools. Sometimes there are tools that we can use, like glossaries and things like that, or we can look at the text features that we talked about the other day. What else?
We could like sound it out and split the word half.
So if you're having trouble reading the word, that's a great strategy. What if you know how to read the word, but you're just not sure what it means? And maybe there's no glossary. What could you do?
Dictionary.
Could use a dictionary. When you're reading, sometimes, remember we said it's a word. Sometimes it's more than a word. Sometimes it's like a concept or an idea. So hold on to your thinking for just a second. When you're reading, sometimes I go back and reread to see if maybe I was just confused, and if I read it again, if that might clear it up. Do we tell you guys to reread? Absolutely, all the time. The reason why we do that is because we want to make sure that you understand what you're reading. So if you're reading along and you get confused, go back and reread. So that's one thing I do. I can go back and reread. I could also just keep going and stop maybe at the end of the paragraph or at the end of the next paragraph and see if maybe once I read a little bit more information, if that cleared it up for me. So that's another thing I can do. I can read on. So there's two things I can do really when I get confused about a concept or an idea. One is I could go back and reread. The second thing is I could read on and stop later on. Make sense? What two things can I do if I'm confused? What's one?
Go back and reread.
Yes. What's another?
Stop at and then go for the next paragraph.
Yeah. You can read on a little bit and stop at the end of the next paragraph. We're going to pause here because I want to make sure that we get to our last strategy, which is summarizing. When you summarize what you read, you're really just telling what you learned that's important. So it's trying to figure out in your mind, okay, what are the big ideas? What's important about what I learned? Okay? So this is kind of a lot. But these are 4 strategies that you've actually done before. You practiced them with Mrs. Chittenden, you practiced them with Mrs. Longcheck, you practiced them in 3rd grade. Today, we're going to be reading a little bit of a book, and we're going to be using these 4 strategies as we read. We'll be making predictions, we'll be asking questions about our reading, we'll be clarifying, noticing that things are confusing to us, and we'll be summarizing. The reason why these are kind of in a circle like this, it looks a little bit like a wheel, how they're all kind of together like this, that's because when you're reading, you're actually doing these things in your mind the whole time. And you're doing them all together. It's not like you read the book once and predict, and then you go back and read it all over again and question, and then you go back and read it all over again and clarify. That would be silly. Good readers are doing these things throughout their reading. You're constantly thinking about what you're reading. And these are just some ways to focus your thinking. So as we're reading today, some of you I had a chance to look at this book with earlier. We actually made a lot of predictions about the first couple of pages of the book that we're going to be reading, okay? So we're going to start off today by sharing with you, those of you who weren't with us yesterday, some of the predictions that we made. So when you get this, go ahead and turn to pages 2 and 3. So what we had done earlier is we'd taken a look at the table of contents. We've gone through and noticed some of the text features.